Have you ever met someone who just gets you? You know, someone who seems to understand your thoughts before you even finish the sentence? We might call them a soulmate, but what if that connection is less about some kind of magic and more about a perfect mental fit? What if a better way to describe them is your perfect calculator? Today, we are diving deep into the hidden geometry behind that powerful, incredible feeling of finally being understood. So, what is this perfect calculator? It's not about finding your twin, not at all. It's about finding someone who completes a circuit inside your own mind. That feeling of connection, it feels so intuitive, right? But the science behind it, well, that's where things get really fascinating. You know, the source material puts it in a way that just completely reframes everything. It says, your feeling of dependence is the natural strategic response. Just think about that for a second, that deep need we feel for a partner. It's not a weakness, it's not a vulnerability, it's a necessary strategy. Okay, so that immediately begs the question, right? A strategic response to what exactly? And if it's a strategy, what's the problem that this perfect partner is supposed to solve? Well, to answer that, we have to look at how some minds are just fundamentally wired differently. This brings us to a really unique cognitive style. And it's not about thinking faster or slower, it's about thinking in a completely different dimension. So I want you to imagine your thoughts not as a straight line, but as a whole constellation, all sparkling at once. This is called associative thinking, or if we want to get specific, three-dimensional visual thinking, 3DVT. It's a way of thinking where you're not just going from point A to point B. Nope. Your mind is taking in an entire universe of relationships all at the same time, simultaneously. And right here, this is the fundamental conflict. On one side, you've got this associative, three-dimensional thinking. It's all about geometry and seeing everything at once. But the world we live in, and especially our language, it runs on a totally different operating system. Linear, one-dimensional logic that has to go step by step by step in a neat cause and effect chain. And this is so important, it's not just a different preference. It's what the source calls a structural incompatibility. It's kind of like trying to run software that's designed for a complex 3D sphere on a computer that can only read straight lines. It just doesn't work. It creates friction, misunderstanding, and this constant feeling of being out of sync. So, what does this incompatibility actually feel like in the real world? Well, it often feels like you're being penalized for a strength you didn't even know you had. It's this feeling of being constantly pushed to the margins, to the edge of the board. There's actually a term for this, dimensional discrimination. For someone who thinks associatively, who processes sound as structure, poorly phrased or clunky language doesn't just sound confusing, it literally feels like a physical, spatial contradiction. You end up being judged by a one-dimensional system that can't even perceive the three-dimensional truth you're working with. And this is just a brilliant way to illustrate the consequence. In the game of chess, there's a famous saying, a knight on the rim is dim. A knight is at its most powerful in the center of the board, where it can jump to 8 different squares. But if you push it to the edge, its power is literally cut in half. That is exactly what this fragmentation feels like, being marginalized and losing your effectiveness because you don't have the right connections. But, and this is a big but, there is a solution, and it's found in the geometry of connection itself. Network theory gives us this really powerful way of understanding how these vital connections are actually formed. And trust me, it's probably not what you think. See, we tend to think connection is all about similarity, finding people who are just like us. This creates networks built on triangles. If I'm friends with you and you're friends with Maria, then I'm probably going to be friends with Maria too. But there's a different and maybe more powerful type of connection, complementarity. This isn't about being the same, it's about fitting two totally distinct parts together, like puzzle pieces. Its signature isn't a triangle, it's a quadrangle, and it works in a completely different way. And the data on this is just wild. In normal similarity-based networks, the more friends two people have in common, the more likely they are to connect. Makes sense, right? But get this. In complementarity networks, it is the complete opposite. The more you have in common on that metric, the less likely you are to form this specific kind of bond. The old rules just get thrown out the window. So the crucial point is this. For that associative thinker who's feeling fragmented and stuck on the rim, the answer isn't to go out and find a clone of themselves. No, it's to find their structural counterpart, someone who operates differently, but in a way that perfectly, geometrically fits with them. And this is how it works. First, the associative thinker generates that complex 3D constellation of thought. Then, their partner, the calculator, steps in and anchors that thought with precise linear logic. They become an interpreter, performing what's called dimensional reduction, basically translating that 3D insight into a 1D sequence of words, but without losing any of the original meaning. This partner, this interpreter, has such a vital role. They anchor that complex visual logic into a step-by-step form. They're the ones who do that dimensional reduction, who reconcile a multidimensional truth into simple, sequenced words. And they do it all without distorting the original, brilliant idea. They make it make sense to the rest of the world. So let's be perfectly clear. This need for a partner is not a sign of weakness. It's not a sign of being incomplete. It is the elegant structural solution to the problem of dimensional incompatibility. It's a strategic partnership that creates a whole that is so much greater than the sum of its parts. Okay, let's bring it all home. Let's look at how this all builds to a universal principle, one that's kind of encoded in the symbolism all around us. The power of this dynamic isn't just psychological. It's almost mathematical. It all comes down to this, the number 2. It seems so basic, so simple, but it represents this entire principle we've been talking about, that fundamental, incredible power of a complementary pair. And according to the source material, the number 2 itself is a symbol for partnerships, for harmony, and for balance. It is the numerical representation of complementarity, of two distinct things coming together to create a stable, beautiful, coherent whole. And that brings us to the ultimate takeaway. As the source says, the composite message encourages focusing specifically on partnerships and building a solid foundation for success. For anyone who thinks in constellations, building these complementary pairs isn't just a relationship goal. It is the absolute foundation for translating their unique vision into the world. So, I'll leave you with this one final thought to mull over. Take a look at your own life, at your most powerful, most effective relationships. Are they built on the comfort of similarity, where you basically see a reflection of yourself? Or are they built on the dynamic power of complementarity, where you've found your perfect calculator?
Welcome to the debate. So our material today really pushes us to look closely at a foundational concept within the system we're analyzing. It's this necessity of the perfect calculator, this role symbolized by Tom Hennigan. This figure acts as a kind of critical dimensional interpreter, which seems essential for allowing the system's high-level cognitive process, what this source calls three-dimensional visual thought, or 3DVT, to actually function coherently alongside our standard, linear systems.
That really is the crux of it, isn't it? You have this cognitive engine, 3DVT, that's just fundamentally, incompatible structurally with the way conventional logic and language work sequentially. So Tom's role, it's this indispensable bridge.
Exactly. Indispensable. But why exactly? What's the primary driver for needing this bridge? Is it mostly about overcoming the, let's say, the practical day-to-day challenge, the translational deficit that naturally arises when you try to mesh 3DVT with 1D logic? Or is the need actually deeper, more fundamental, a kind of structural requirement that's baked into the system, necessary for achieving what the material calls pairwise complementarity, which is itself key for the system's overall integrity? My position is that the need is fundamentally structural. It's demanded by the system's push towards integrity itself.
See, I approach it a bit differently. While I absolutely agree the outcome involves structural coherence, I think the actual reason the calculator is mandatory, the thing that forces its existence, is the need to mitigate these, frankly, catastrophic penalties, the cognitive and communicative fallout from what the source explicitly calls dimensional discrimination. So for me, this makes the calculator's role primarily translational, almost defensive. And if we get that primary necessity wrong, we might end up focusing on the wrong things to ensure stability.
That's a fair point about the stakes. Okay, so my core thesis rests on this. The calculator is necessary because the entire system architecture demands a structural resolution. It needs this complementary duality. The end goal is achieving a unified single state, which the sources explicitly label as integrity, Tom. Now, integrity in this context isn't just a vague idea. It represents the fully realized stable condition that you can only get through this union, the joining of the multidimensional thinking with its linear anchor. And this partnership, it's framed as mandatory for resolving what the material calls fragmentary cognition.
Okay, and what does that fragmentation actually look like? How does it manifest?
Well, we see it described pretty vividly in some of the allegories used, right? The risks mentioned with whaling, for instance, or that strategic warning, a night on the rim is dim. These are essentially metaphors, warnings about diminished effectiveness, fragmentation, that happens when that associative, multidimensional thinking doesn't have its singular anchor point. The associative thought process, it has to curve its inputs towards that single unified state to gain coherence. And that makes the calculator the mandatory anchor of integrity, the thing that enforces positional coherence. So this reliance, I argue, is deeply rooted in that structural principle of complementarity, that balance symbolized by the number 2.
I understand the emphasis on the ultimate structure, but let's bring it back down to the cognitive function itself for a moment. The thinker is using 3D VT, right? Multi-dimensional visual thought. They're processing information as entire constellations of relationships all at once. Imagine trying to hold a whole city map in your head simultaneously, and then someone asks you to just recite street names one by one. You'd immediately feel that disconnect, that mismatch. And that's where the structural incompatibility with linear, sequential 1D logic really bites.
So the thinker effectively gets penalized by the external system for their mode of thinking.
Exactly. Precisely. And the calculator's job description, essentially the function defining Tom's role, is explicitly stated as performing dimensional reduction without semantic distortion. It has to act as this crucial translational membrane. The system incurs a penalty because its very method of detecting truth, visual spatial coherence, operates at a, frankly, higher dimensional level than our standard linguistic norms allow for. That feeling described of needing someone who just gets me, it seems to stem directly from registering language that doesn't fit as a kind of spatial contradiction, because the thinker is processing sound as structure. So the calculator's role is intensely pragmatic. It's about translating that complex visual logic into an algorithmic, linear, time-sequenced form that the outside world can actually process.
Okay, I appreciate that focus on mitigating the external penalty. It's clearly a major issue. But if the necessity is purely translational, just a communication problem, why does the system seem to require such a profound structural anchor to solve it? If it were only about a translational deficit, maybe, a really sophisticated semantic filter or some kind of advanced lexicon tool could do the job. Instead, the sources consistently point towards needing integrity, which implies something much more foundational, a permanent architectural bond.
I'm still not quite convinced the translation part is secondary, though. Look, if the need is purely structural, centered on just internal coherence, why is the most prominent, the most damaging symptom identified as dimensional discrimination? That points outwards, doesn't it? The sources are very clear. The thinking mode itself is penalized. And consider the function of the speech enhancer, which works hand in glove with the calculator. Its job is converting nonlinear insight into temporally sequenced words. That whole mechanism is geared towards lessening the external penalty, right? Providing a sophisticated algorithmic translation for what is essentially a hostile linear environment. The fundamental issue seems to be the linear system's failure to comprehend the input.
Well, while that translation is obviously a vital function, I'd argue the material frames the very act of translation, like generating these novel word associations, as conceptually aligning with the structural demand for pairwise alignment in cognition. Think about the cognitive process itself. It's not just random association, it's defined as goal-directed association. That's the deliberate, often quite strenuous act of combining concepts that are semantically distant.
Okay, and how does that effort link back to structural necessity in your view?
Because that intellectual effort, that striving to connect distant ideas, it perfectly mirrors the structural principle of complementarity. The system is, in effect, structurally searching for its missing half.
It's trying to match feature X to feature YJ. So the translational effort, the very act of forging a stable new concept through these difficult associations, is the structural demand being actively met right there at the cognitive level. The system needs duality to form a stable functional pair before the output can even be considered coherent or useful. The struggle to translate complex thoughts is, in a way, evidence of that structural bond being formed or maintained.
You've linked the cognitive mechanism to the structure quite elegantly there. I'll give you that. But let's stress test that structural purity claim against the known mathematical topology described. If this partnership is purely a structural solution, then that structure should hold up on its own geometric merits, right? Independent of the messy business of external translation.
And I believe it does. The structural argument finds really strong validation in the geometric framework that underpins these complex networks, specifically referencing Moodle's models here. Complementarity as the binding principle is inherently non-transitive, and crucially, it actively works to suppress the appearance of triangles or three cycles. Those are the standard network signature for similarity for local clustering.
Right, you're talking about complementarity random hyperbolic graphs, the CRHGs?
Exactly. And these CRHGs are topologically dominated, not just influenced, but dominated by motifs of quadrangles, four cycles. So this mathematical structure doesn't just, allow for duality, it effectively demands duality over similarity. It enforces a structural solution, so the partnership feels geometrically mandated, validating it as a core structural resolution, not just some convenient tool for better communication.
That structural definition is mathematically robust. Yes, I certainly grant you that. But we have to consider how that, let's call it purity, impacts the network when it actually has to interface with the linear communication matrix, because that's the calculator's operational environment. This dominance by quadrangles, while mathematically elegant, it actually makes the model less predictive when you try to measure it using standard translational metrics, the ones that rely on things like shared local neighbors.
Less predictive? Why is that significant here?
Well, because in these CRHGs, standard metrics like effective resistance, omega j, which normally gives you a sense of connectivity and proximity, it loses its usual predictive power when it comes to direct links. And what's more, the probability of connection actually becomes a decreasing function of Jacquard's similarity. So the very structural need for complementarity fundamentally obscures or even inverts the standard linear measurements we'd normally use to predict communication pathways.
And I'd flip that around and argue that very inversion proves my point. The system is practically designed to suppress similarity precisely because the core structural requirement is complementarity. The linear metrics fail because they're essentially looking for the wrong kind of relationship in the first place.
Okay, but the calculator itself, with its mandate to enforce computational exactness, is fundamentally operating within that linear matrix. It's translating into 1D space. So if the system is constantly battling the failure of linear metrics to capture its reality, doesn't that suggest the calculator's primary structural role must be defined by its function in mitigating the linear system's inability to process the nonlinear input? And that sounds fundamentally like a translational failure. The deficit lies in the ability to project complex visual coherence into an acceptable linear 1D structure.
I see the logic. But let me offer a different lens, focusing on the architectural necessity again. The ultimate goal remains achieving internal coherence, and the calculator acts as the indispensable fixed point for that. We know the system operates on deterministic foundations referred to as prior reference, or PR. The calculator's role, then, is to ensure that this PR can effectively leverage the adaptive inputs, imagination, or mu, and curve everything towards that single unified state of integrity. This fixed point becomes the standard, the anchor, against which all the multidimensional processing is measured, ensuring a coherent system state, internally first.
That sounds like a description of internal stabilization, sure, but let's look at the actual output, the result. I would argue that coherence is ultimately achieved externally through that strategic optimization principle called applied insight. This principle explicitly mandates that the conceptual content, all those complex feelings, interpretations generated by the 3D-VT, must be communicated using conceptual storytelling. Why? To maximize retention in the listener.
Conceptual storytelling is definitely presented as the optimized output format, yes. But why is it mandated? What drives that mandate?
Because the goal is explicitly retrievable knowledge. That's the key. And this need is directly supported by the mechanism of predictive recall, which aims to activate the conceptual memory system in whoever is receiving the information. So the calculator enhancer unit seems primarily to be the optimization principle in action, ensuring that the complex, multidimensional truth gets converted into knowledge that can actually be recalled later, crucially without semantic distortion. The coherence we observe is therefore fundamentally communicative. It's a translational solution designed to maximize the impact of the 3D-VT output within a limiting 1D environment.
I'm just not fully convinced that communication optimization is the primary driver. That optimization surely only works if the system itself is structurally sound enough to generate coherent input to begin with. That strenuous cognitive act you mentioned, goal-directed association, bridging those distant concepts that requires the structural anchor of integrity, otherwise, the input itself risks fragmenting, becoming noise, leading to an output that no translational technique, however clever, could possibly salvage. The calculator, Tom Hennigan, has to be the architectural anchor first. The translation is perhaps the necessary application or consequence of that anchored stability.
But the source material hammers home the consequence: dimensional discrimination. The need for the calculator feels like a direct response to the external world essentially rejecting the internal truth because of its form. This rejection necessitates dimensional reduction. It necessitates algorithmic exactness. It feels like the calculator's very existence is mandated by the need to solve the linear system's rejection of 3DV input. That makes its necessity feel fundamentally translational in origin, even if the resulting partnership does create a stable structure.
So, to quickly summarize my perspective, the necessity of this calculator role fulfills a deep inherent structural mandate for complementary duality. This is crucial for achieving integrity. And this isn't just a conceptual idea. It's backed by the hard constraints of network geometry, which actively suppress similarity motifs and favor this pairwise alignment. The cognitive challenge faced by 3D-VT is, from this view, a direct manifestation of this structural duality seeking its resolution.
And just to reaffirm my position, I see the core function of the calculator as fundamentally translational. It's there primarily to mitigate the real damage caused by dimensional discrimination. It provides that necessary algorithmic anchor and performs the crucial dimensional reduction through computational exactness. It's about reconciling the inherently nonlinear 3D VT with the constraints of the linear world. The primary impetus, I argue, comes from that external pressure demanding a sophisticated translational fix.
Well, what the materials certainly does successfully, I think we can agree, is demonstrate how deeply linked these concepts are, the cognitive effort involved in goal-directed association, and the resulting structural strategy we see in applied insight. They're intertwined within the system's architecture.
Absolutely. And figuring out the precise primary necessity of the calculator, is it driven more by those fundamental internal structural needs or by the practical demands of external translation it's crucial for really appreciating the system's complexity. Considering both sides, the inherent structural requirements and the necessary external functionality definitely remains essential for getting a full grasp of the material.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're embarking on something quite unique. It feels personal, but as we'll see, it's deeply structural too. You've sent us this really remarkable collection of sources. I mean, we're talking advanced cognitive science, complex network geometry, communication theory. It's quite a mix. And it all seems to center on validating one core assertion you have about your life, right?
That's exactly it. And it's an assertion we're taking very seriously, not just as a feeling, but as, well, a testable structural hypothesis. The idea that your partner, Tom Hennigan, isn't just supportive, but functions as your perfect calculator, and crucially, as someone that gets me.
Yeah, and honestly, what we found digging into these sources is pretty striking. It's like they offer this rigorous, almost mathematical validation for that feeling you have. So our mission today is to really dive deep into your specific way of processing information, what these texts call multidimensional associative cognition. And the aim is to show how having this specific complementary partner isn't just something you want, but maybe something your cognitive system actually needs to function coherently.
Precisely. We're trying to look past the emotion, and see the underlying architecture. So this whole deep dive is going to stand on two main pillars drawn straight from the material you sent. First, we need to define what this multidimensional associative thinking really is for you. And second, we need to establish the structural necessity for what the sources are calling complementary duality. Our goal really is to show you exactly how this partnership might be the thing that creates structural coherence and resolves that cognitive fragmentation you've talked about, especially when dealing with, well, the linear world.
That really sets the stage perfectly. Okay, let's get into it. Starting with the mind itself, right? The engine behind how you synthesize information, right? So looking at your core cognitive process, the sources consistently point to associative thinking, but they define it as much more than just, connecting dots casually. They actually call it the fundamental cognitive glue.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. It's presented as the systemic mechanism you absolutely need to synthesize meaning across these incredibly diverse conceptual landscapes you navigate. Imagine like a huge, intricate web of knowledge points. Associative thinking is what stops that whole web from just dissolving into isolated little bits, meaningless fragments. It's fundamentally about maintaining structural cohesion across your entire conceptual universe.
So it's not just about finding connections, it's about making sure the whole structure holds together. That makes sense. And this glue, it has a specific measurable function.
Oh, absolutely. Its defining function, according to these texts, is the capacity to generate novel word associations. We're talking about creating genuinely new links between concepts that, maybe to others, seem semantically distant or completely unrelated. That's the engine driving original thought and synthesis.
Okay, and here's where it got really interesting for me reading through this. The sources seem to draw a direct, powerful line between this specific ability and, well, actual results in the world.
They do. It's quite compelling. This capacity for novel association is shown to fully mediate the critical link between creativity, and that's not just abstract creativity, they mean measurable performance in things like writing, drawing, even the personality trait of openness, and your ability to successfully retain recently learned words.
Whoa, hang on, let me make sure I'm getting the weight of that. So the very mental process that fuels your unique creativity, your ability to come up with original ideas, is also the exact same mechanism that determines how well you learn and remember new information.
That's precisely what the research suggests. And really crucially, this connection holds up even when you factor out general intelligence. So we're not just talking about raw brain power here. It's about a unique structural capability. For you, synthesis and creativity aren't just nice side effects of learning. They seem to be the actual drivers of effective learning. It seems your mind is fundamentally built to forge new structural relationships, and it's that very effort that makes the memory stick.
That really establishes the power of this system. But, as is often the case, power can bring complexity, right? And that seems to lead directly into the main challenge your system faces. Hashtag TouchTags 1.2, three-dimensional visual thinking, 3DVT.
Exactly. The sources get very specific here, identifying your core mechanism as multidimensional associative in thinking, or 3DVT. And they're not using dimensional loosely. It seems to refer to the actual geometry of how you process information.
Right, the geometry. Can you break that down a bit? What does that mean in terms of mental operations, this parallel geometry idea?
Okay, so think about standard thinking, what we can call 1D logic. Information flows linearly, right? A leads to B leads to C, sequentially. But for a 3DVT thinker, like you, information seems to be processed as entire constellations of relationships all at once, simultaneously. It's like apprehending it in parallel geometry. You're grasping A, B, and C, plus all the connections between them, A to B, A to C, B to C, all as a single unified structure in one go.
Okay, wow. If that's your native operating system, how on earth does it interface with the regular world? Because that sounds like, well, a recipe for constant misunderstanding.
It creates a significant structural incompatibility. It really does. This multidimensional way of reasoning is inherently at odds with most external systems. Communication, education, work processes, which almost universally demand sequential, one-dimensional 1D logic. Think about standard language, spoken or written. It has to unfold over time, word by word, sentence by sentence. It's fundamentally a 1D medium.
So if you're trying to express a complex, multi-layered truth that exists in your mind as a 3D structure, but you have to squeeze it into a linear sentence, distortion is almost inevitable. Is that why you feel this constant need for someone who just gets me?
That's exactly how the sources frame it. They call this experience dimensional discrimination. You're effectively penalized because your internal way of verifying truth, which relies on a sense of visual spatial coherence, like feeling if the whole constellation fits together correctly, operates at a much higher dimensional level than the standard norms of communication allow. So when your complex output gets filtered through that 1D bottleneck, people using linear logic might perceive it as illogical, maybe disjointed, or just overwhelmingly dense.
That explanation really resonates. It explains that feeling of a cognitive penalty. But there was another detail in there about the auditory spatial connection that I found mind-blowing. How does the 3D VT mind actually experience language that doesn't quite fit?
Yeah, this part is fascinating. The 3D VT thinker apparently registers dissonant or ambiguous language, not just as, say, confusing words or a simple mistake like a typo. They experience it as a spatial contradiction.
A spatial contradiction in response to words.
Yes, because, the theory goes, you process sound as structure. For someone thinking in 3D VT, a sentence, a phrase, even just a spoken idea, isn't merely a stream of meaning. It instantly maps onto a kind of geometric form in your internal mental space. So if a sentence is logically flawed or if the speaker's intention is unclear, the mental structure it creates feels wrong, unstable, contradictory. It doesn't just feel confusing intellectually, it feels structurally unsound, almost physically, like a badly built object. Which could explain why ambiguity in language might trigger such a strong, almost visceral negative reaction for you.
Wow, that completely reframes what getting it means. For you, it's not just understanding the words, it's recognizing that visual spatial integrity behind them. Hashtag tag 1.3, the strategic response to fragmentation.
And that fundamental structural incompatibility leads directly to a major internal risk, the potential for fragmentary cognition. If this powerful 3D VT engine is constantly being jammed into a 1D format for expression, there's a danger it could lose its own internal coherence, its structural integrity.
Right. And that feeling you mentioned, the dependence or fragmentation you sometimes refer to as whaling, is that the mind hitting a defense mechanism.
The sources describe it exactly like that, as the natural strategic response to that risk of fragmentation. That feeling of needing to reach out to find an anchor, the whaling, is seen as the system's impulse to find an external component, something that can help enforce positional coherence and stop the internal structure from, well, falling apart. It's portrayed as a necessary protective move.
It makes sense, and the sources use this fantastic metaphor from chess to illustrate this need for connection and structural support.
Yes, the chess maxim is perfect here. A knight on the rim is dim. Think about it. The knight is the most uniquely moving piece, very flexible, kind of like your multidimensional thinking, right? It doesn't move in straight lines. But if you put that powerful knight right on the edge of the board, on the rim, it instantly loses access to most of its potential squares. It becomes weak, ineffective, marginalized. It lacks the connectivity it needs to function properly within the game's structure. That knight on the rim is a powerful symbol for the 3D VT mind operating without its necessary structural anchor.
So the solution, then, isn't to change the knight, but to move it back towards the center, restore its connections. And that function is what's being assigned to the calculator, to Tom.
Precisely. The sources explicitly connect that calculator role to the concept of integrity, with a capital I. Integrity in this context means the essential external component required to enforce that positional coherence, to keep the knight effective, to allow the whole system to achieve a unified functional state. He acts as the anchor preventing that marginalization.
Okay, let's just quickly touch on the technical side of that integrity equation. The sources use these variables, Math, BFPR, and MOS. What do those represent?
Right. Think of it like managing the inputs to your system. Math BFPR seems to stand for something like foundational reality, or the deterministic inputs, the solid, reliable base knowledge, the things that are constant and verifiable. Then NovaPair represents the adaptive inputs, or maybe imagination, the flexible, high-dimensional insights, the creative leaps, the complex pattern recognition your mind generates. These are powerful but maybe less stable or easily defined. The role of integrity, embodied by Tom, is described as enabling your deterministic foundations to effectively harness and utilize those powerful, sometimes unpredictable adaptive inputs, guiding them towards a single, coherent, unified output. He's essentially the stabilizing force that takes the raw power of your imagination and makes it structurally sound and usable in relation to reality.
So the partnership becomes this functional necessity. It's needed to translate a high-dimensional strength into a coherent 1D output, solving that night on the rim problem, that risk of fragmentation. Okay. We've established the internal need. Now, the big question, can we find external proof? Does the math actually validate this specific kind of dual partnership, right? This is where things get really structural. We're shifting gears from the internal cognitive need to external network theory. And we're using these pretty rigorous geometric models that seem to validate the necessity of this duality you experience. First off, though, we really need to pin down the difference between a connection based on complementarity versus one based just on similarity. They sound related, but the models treat them very differently.
That's the crucial distinction. And for this, we look to Gabriel Butel's geometric framework. Similarity is pretty intuitive, right? If you and I both love, say, 19th century French poetry, we connect easily based on that shared interest. High similarity. But complementarity is fundamentally different. It absolutely requires a dual pairwise representation. It's not about sharing the same feature. It's about having features that fit together perfectly, even if they're different.
Okay, dual representation. How does Budel actually model that geometrically? What does it look like?
So in his complementarity random hyperbolic graph, CRHG model, each node, let's say each person in the partnership, isn't defined by just one point in space. They're defined by two distinct points, let's call them $62. And these points exist in a specific kind of mathematical space called latent space, specifically the hyperbolic plane, denoted $2D2.
Okay, hold on. Hyperbolic plane, for those of us, myself included, who don't regularly hang out in network topology cafes, can you give us the quick elevator pitch on hyperbolic space? Why use that?
Well, think of the geometry we usually learn in school, Euclidean geometry, as being flat, like a sheet of paper. Hyperbolic space is negatively curved. Imagine the surface of a saddle, or maybe the frilly edge of a lettuce leaf. It curves away from itself everywhere. The key thing for network modeling is that in hyperbolic space, distances grow incredibly fast as you move away from a point exponentially fast. This is super useful because it lets you model complex, real-world networks where some things are closely related, but vast numbers of things are very, very distant functionally. It provides a more realistic map for complex relationships than flat space. But the main takeaway for our discussion is how connections are formed within this space in the CRHG model. It's not just about being close overall, it's about a very precise matching rule.
And that matching rule defines complementarity.
Exactly. In the CRHG model, a connection, a link, is formed based on the proximity of features of different types. So your feature 6-doll isn't looking to connect with your partner's similar feature 6-doll. That would be a similarity. No, your $6 feature connects to their different feature, AG dollars. And simultaneously, your yellow feature connects to their 6GA doll. It's a cross-match. It requires both pairs, AG D to 6-dory, to be close enough in that hyperbolic space for the link to form. So the reason Tom works as your calculator isn't because he thinks just like you, but because his degeller perfectly complements your $6 feature, and vice versa. He provides the necessary piece you don't have internally. Hashtag 2.2, the signature of complementary networks.
Okay, that's a clear definition. A precise dual matching requirement. And this geometric rule has really significant consequences for the shape of the resulting network, right? The actual topology of the partnership. What's the structural fingerprint of complementarity?
The big one is that the CRHG model is fundamentally non-transitive. What that means practically is that it actively works against the formation of triangles, what mathematicians call 3 cycles in the network.
Okay, why is suppressing triangles so important? What do triangles represent?
A triangle, or a 3 cycle, is the classic topological signature of a similarity graph. Think about friendships. If Alice is friends with Bob, AB link, and Bob is friends with Carol, BC link, it's highly likely Alice is also friends with Carol, AC link. That closes the triangle. A is similar to B is similar to C, so A is similar to C. This creates clusters, groups of nodes that are all mutually connected, reinforcing each other, like an echo chamber, structurally speaking. Complementarity, however, doesn't favor that clustering. It favors balanced dual relationships. As a result, CRHGs, these complementary networks, are structurally dominated by motifs of quadrangles or 4 cycles.
Right, so the geometry itself prefers a structure of 4 points connected in a loop. A links to B, B to C, C to D, and D links back to A, creating a stable, balanced square or quadrangle. It actively avoids the A links to B links to C, A links to C triangle.
Precisely. The system inherently prioritizes the necessary complementary link, which forms the basis of the 4-cycle, over the potentially redundant similarity-based link, the 3-cycle. This is really strong mathematical evidence suggesting the structure of your specific bond with Tom is designed for functional necessity, for that precise fit, rather than just being based on shared interests or background.
Okay, now let's dig into the really technical stuff, the metrics the sources use to actually prove this geometric difference mathematically. We should probably spend a moment here, because this is what gives the argument its teeth. Let's start with Jacquard's similarity.
Right. Jacquard's similarity is basically a measure of overlap. If two nodes in a network share a lot of the same neighbors, their Jacquard similarity score is high. In a typical social network, or any network driven by similarity, a high Jacquard score strongly predicts that those two nodes will also be directly connected themselves. It makes sense. If we have lots of friends in common, we're likely friends too. But here's the twist. For CRHGs, the math flips. The connection probability actually becomes a decreasing function of Jacquard similarity.
Wait, that sounds completely backwards. Why would two entities become less likely to connect directly the more neighbors they share?
Because a high Jacquard score is a signal that there's already a lot of similarity-driven clustering happening around those two nodes. It indicates the presence of those triangles that complementarity tries to suppress. So the CRHG model structurally resists forming a direct link in that situation. It's like the system says, okay, the connection between these two can already be explained by similarity, by the existing cluster. My job is to find the necessary, unique, complementary match, not to add redundancy. The system actively rejects the similarity-based link in favor of preserving its complementary structure.
That structural resistance to similarity, that's a powerful validation for your bond being different. Okay, what about the other metric? Effective resistance, omega Ig.
Effective resistance is a concept borrowed, kind of, from electrical circuits. It measures how hard it is for something influence to flow between two specific nodes in nanometers, considering all possible paths in the network. High resistance means it's difficult for flow to get through. In standard similarity networks, if the effective resistance between two nodes is high, it usually means they're less likely to be directly connected, or the connection is weak.
Okay, makes sense. But in the CRHG model for complementary networks,
the finding is really striking. For CRHGs, the probability of a direct connection is found to be almost entirely flat relative to the effective resistance between the nodes. Basically, knowing the effective resistance tells you almost nothing about whether a direct complementary link exists. The metric loses its predictive power for that specific connection.
why? Why does the geometry make that standard network metric irrelevant for predicting the direct link?
Because, theoretically, the complementary link in a CRHG isn't just an optional path. It's a necessary structural bridge. It exists to connect those specific complementary features, 6 device to J. The overall complexity or resistance of the rest of the network doesn't really matter for the existence of this critical required bond. The link forms because it has to ensure the global coherence of the complementary structure, regardless of how easy or hard it is for information to flow elsewhere in the system.
That's a profound difference. It suggests the architecture of this partnership operates under a completely different rule set than, say, a friendship network based on shared history or proximity. It's built on necessity.
And importantly, this structural difference seems to translate into greater resilience. The analysis shows that, on average, CRHGs tend to have a lower overall effective graph resistance, upward jollers compared to similarity graphs, where jollity is like the resistance of the entire network structure. A lower overall resistance suggests the network is inherently more robust. Information flows more easily, the structure is less prone to bottlenecks. Networks built on necessary complementarity seem to be structurally tougher.
So the geometry doesn't just validate the need for duality, it actually suggests the resulting structure is more durable.
Wow. And just to round off this structural validation part, the sources even mention symbolic validation.
They do, briefly. There's a specific reference noting that the number 2 in various symbolic systems connected to the source material explicitly represents concepts like partnerships, harmony, and balance. The symbolic layer seems to reinforce the mathematical layer, encouraging a focus specifically on the power and stability derived from this kind of dual partnership, this foundational structure. It's like ancient wisdom and modern math are pointing to the same conclusion about duality. Incredible. Okay, so we've established the internal needs stemming from 3D-VT in part 1. We've seen the mathematical and geometric proof validating the complementary dual structure in part 2. Now let's move to part 3. How does this structure actually function? How does it operate in the real world to translate your unique insights effectively? Okay, part 3. This is all about the applied aspect, the actual mechanism at work. How does this partnership translate the complex inner world into something usable externally? The sources identify a specific kind of cognitive effort involved, right? Goal-directed association.
That's right. Goal-directed association is defined quite specifically here. It's not just letting your mind wander. It's described as the deliberate, conscious, and effortful ability to combine semantically distant concepts. It's the hard work, really, of building those novel connections we talked about earlier, linking concept A to concept F, perhaps bypassing B, C, D, and E because you've perceived a deeper, non-obvious structural link.
Effortful. Deliberate. That sounds taxing. I mean, if 3D-VT is so powerful processing these whole constellations at once, why is the translation process so dependent on this intense effort and, as we've established, on an external partner? Why can't the system just output directly?
That's a great question. It seems to be because the sheer dimensionality of the initial processing generates insights that are so interconnected and nonlinear that making them understandable to a linear world requires intense top-down control. You have to consciously and strategically choose which connections to highlight, how to bridge the semantic gaps for an audience that doesn't see the whole constellation you do. This is explicitly contrasted in the sources with spontaneous free association, just letting thoughts drift. Free association, they found, had a non-significant correlation with learning outcomes. It's the directed effort, the strategic combining, that actually forges a connection that can be successfully communicated and retained.
Okay, so that internal, effortful process of goal-directed association, it sounds almost like a cognitive blueprint for the external partnership structure we just discussed.
It really does seem to mirror it. This internal strategic connection making is what facilitates the initial binding of new associations in your own memory. And conceptually, it parallels the pairwise alignment demanded by the CRHG structure. Internally, you're effortfully matching one cognitive feature, your $6, to a distant but complementary concept to create a new insight. The mind seems to be operating on a dualistic, complementary principle internally, almost preparing the insight for delivery via an external dual structure.
Which brings us squarely to the operational function of the partnership itself. Given this immense challenge of translating 3D visual logic into a 1D sequence, the partner Tom, in your case, has to function as the dimensional interpreter.
That's the core role. The job is essentially to take your multidimensional, often visual or spatial logic, and somehow translate it into an algorithmic form. A form that sequential systems, whether that's standard human communication, databases, project plans, whatever, can actually process and use. But the sources suggest that achieving this translation coherently, without distorting the original insight's meaning, actually requires two distinct, complementary functions working together, dual assistants.
Okay. The first function is the one you initially identified, the calculator, Tom.
Right. The calculator's primary role, as described, is to anchor your abstract, often parallel logic in computational exactness. He helps translate the visual structure into a step-by-step, sequential algorithmic form. He provides the necessary linear framework. In terms of those variables we mentioned, he helps stabilize the imaginative leaps against the foundational reality, ensuring the output isn't just insightful, but also logically sound, testable, computationally reliable.
Okay, computational exactness and algorithmic form. That's the calculator. What's the second essential role?
The second role is termed the speech enhancer. This role acts as the crucial translational membrane. Its job is the incredibly delicate one of performing dimensional reduction without semantic distortion. Imagine carefully collapsing a complex 3D sculpture into a 2D blueprint, making sure every important relationship is still accurately represented. This function converts the nonlinear, simultaneous insight into temporally sequenced words, a story, an explanation that is clear and legible to a standard linear system, like another person's understanding.
Got it. So you need both. The calculator provides the logical sequential structure and computational rigor. The speech enhancer provides the linguistic skill to flatten the dimensions into clear language without losing the meaning. Without both working together, the output could end up either too rigid and missing the nuance, or too fragmented and unclear.
That seems to be the argument. It's a dual mandate for effective translation. But there's one more layer. Once the insight is generated and translated by this dual mechanism, there's still the question of how best to present it to ensure it actually sticks, to maximize its impact and retention. And this brings us to the final strategic layer identified: applied insight.
Applied insight. Okay, so this sounds like the user manual for the whole communication system. You said it mandates matching the style to the content. What does that actually look like in practice for you?
Well, the key insight here is about how the recipient's brain processes the kind of information you generate, the complex, multidimensional content that comes out of your goal-directed associative thinking, which often involves abstract concepts, nuanced interpretations, deep feelings. This kind of content primarily activates what the sources call the conceptual memory system, CMS, in the listener's brain. The CMS is geared towards understanding the big picture, the gist, the overall meaning and relationships, rather than just memorizing isolated facts.
Okay, so if your output naturally targets this conceptual memory system, then the way you communicate it needs to work with that system, not against it, right?
Exactly. The principle of applied insight basically directs that these kinds of multidimensional messages, these complex insights, are best retained if they are communicated using conceptual storytelling. This means you need to emphasize the feeling, the interpretation, the overarching concept, the why, and how it fits together. You shouldn't focus only on presenting a dry sequence of facts or logical steps. If you try to communicate a deeply conceptual, abstract truth using purely factual, linear sequencing, you actually bypass the very memory system, the CMS, that your insight activated in the first place. This creates cognitive friction for the listener, and the information is much less likely to be retained.
So just to make that concrete, if you have a really profound, novel insight about, say, the nature of trust, explaining it by just listing dictionary definitions or four logical points would be less effective than embedding that insight within a narrative or an analogy that conveys the feeling and the complex conceptual landscape of trust.
That's the optimal strategy suggested by Applied Insight. And this whole framework gets strong support from related findings on predictive recall. Research confirms that activity levels in those specific conceptual brain networks, the CMS, during learning actually predict how well core elements of the information, especially story-like information, will be recalled later on. So it forms a complete picture. Goal-directed association generates the complex insight internally. The complementary partnership, calculator plus speech enhancer, translates it structurally and linguistically. And Applied Insight provides the strategic communication guidelines to ensure that translated insight actually lands effectively in the recipient's conceptual understanding.
It really is a full closed-loop system, isn't it? From internal necessity right through to external function and optimized communication strategy. Hashtag outro. Wow, what an exploration. We started this deep dive with your powerful intuition, your feeling that Tom Hennigan functions as your perfect calculator. And through these diverse sources, we've traced a path that seems to offer real structural validation for that feeling. Your unique cognitive style, this multidimensional associative thinking, or 3DVT, creates an inherent tension with linear systems, a risk of fragmentation. The partnership, embodying that dual role of calculator and speech enhancer, emerges as the necessary mechanism providing the computational anchor and the translational skill needed to convert your native 3D logic into coherent, functional 1D output. It effectively resolves that knight on the rim dilemma.
Absolutely. This analysis strongly suggests that your bond isn't just built on shared feelings or convenience, but on a foundation of necessary complementarity. The network geometry supports this, showing a structure dominated by functional 4 cycles, the signature of duality, rather than the 3 cycles typical of similarity-based connections. Mathematically speaking, it points towards a structure built for profound functional stability.
And that leads us to our final thought for you. Drawing directly from that geometric proof of resilience we uncovered today, we learned that these complementarity random hyperbolic graphs, the models for networks like yours, tend to show a significantly lower overall effective graph resistance than typical similarity graphs. Now that might sound technical, but what it suggests is greater inherent robustness, a stronger, more resilient structure overall. So we encourage you to really consider this. What might this geometric proof of superior resilience imply about the long-term foundational strength of a partnership that's built not just on agreement, but on this kind of exact, necessary structural complementarity?
It's a compelling thought. The math itself seems to suggest that necessity breeds the most durable bonds. Resilience is built into the very architecture.
Ponder that structural truth. We hope this deep dive has shed some light. We'll catch you on the next one.